The great tribunal of the Xelvari Dominion gathered in solemn silence, their elongated, chitin-covered bodies flickering under the cold glow of holographic projections. The High Chancellor, Vokril, extended a clawed limb, pausing the footage before them. The image froze, a lone human, bruised and bloodied, standing in the center of a battlefield littered with fallen warriors, both human and Xelvari alike. The wind howled through the wreckage of shattered war machines, but the human did not kneel. "This is impossible," murmured one of the counselors, their voice clicking with disbelief. "No species should have endured this long. The human should have fallen with the first strike." Yet the human in the projection still stood, not just standing, grinning. Vokril narrowed his luminescent eyes. The human was outnumbered, surrounded by elite Xelvari executioners. Their weapons hummed, blades coated with neurotoxins that could paralyze even the most hardened warrior. And yet, the human cracked their neck, wiped the blood from their lip and raised their fists. "Is that all you've got?" A murmur rippled through the tribunal. This was meant to be an execution, a demonstration of power to break humanity's will. The Xelvari had crushed species before. Empires had collapsed beneath their might, but something was wrong, something they could not understand. The executioners charged, the footage blurred into motion, lightning-fast strikes, a dance of precision and fury. The human ducked, countered, and moved with an unpredictability that defied Xelvari combat protocols. One executioner fell, then another. The tribunal chamber filled with stunned silence. No words, no rationalizations. Just the cold, creeping realization that they had underestimated this species. For the first time in recorded history, a lesson was being taught, and it was not humanity that was the example. The war had not been a war, at least not in the way humanity understood it. Wars had fronts, strategies, battles that decided the fate of nations. The Xelvari Dominion did not fight wars. They exterminated, they conquered. They demonstrated the price of defiance with swift, overwhelming force, ensuring that no species ever dared to challenge their dominion again. And so, when humanity refused to kneel, when their colonies stood firm against the edicts of submission, the Xelvari had decided to make an example of them. The planet of Hadria-IV was chosen for the demonstration, a thriving human colony, rich in resources, now surrounded by a fleet of Xelvari warships. The orders had been clear: annihilation, not just of the military but of their history, their structures, their very memory. Humanity would not simply lose, they would be erased. High Chancellor Vokril had personally overseen the initial assault. The human defenses were crude, laughably outdated compared to the Dominion's vast armaments. Within hours, orbital bombardments had reduced their cities to molten ruins. Their leaders had been captured, their armies scattered. It was done, or so they had thought. In the days following the bombardment, reports had emerged, impossible reports, human resistance cells striking down elite Xelvari hunters, traps that exploited the weaknesses of the Dominion's advanced drones. Sabotage so precise, it suggested an understanding of Xelvari technology far beyond what a lesser species should possess. And then there was the footage. The lone human standing against the executioners, a symbol of defiance in the face of overwhelming power. It had spread through Xelvari networks like a virus, whispered in hushed, uncertain tones. The Dominion had expected the humans to beg, to surrender. Instead, they had turned this massacre into something else, a war. Hadria-IV, ruins of Sector 12, Sergeant Elias Caney crouched behind the remnants of a collapsed sky bridge, the acrid scent of burning alloy thick in the air. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his breathing remained steady. His squad had been reduced to 5, the rest had been lost in the first wave. They should have surrendered. That's what any logical species would have done. But humans weren't logical. They were stubborn, desperate creatures with nothing left to lose, and that made them dangerous. Elias tapped his comm, whispering, "Squad, check in." A chorus of voices responded, hardened, determined, unbroken. The Xelvari had the numbers, the technology, the power of an empire behind them. But humans had the will to fight, and they weren't done yet. The ruins of Hadria-IV were a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered stone. Smoke coiled into the air, the remnants of the Xelvari bombardment still smoldering. But the humans had not died. They had adapted. Sergeant Elias Caney moved like a shadow through the debris, his squad close behind him. They had studied the Xelvari, how they moved, how they hunted. The aliens were meticulous, precise, their patrols synchronized like the ticking gears of a war machine. But gears could be broken, and humans had learned where to apply pressure. Vokril stood in the heart of the Dominion war camp, a towering fortress of alien design. It was meant to be impregnable, an unassailable stronghold that should have crushed any last remnants of resistance. But something was wrong. Reports had been filtering in, Xelvari patrols vanishing without a trace. Sabotage that was too coordinated, too effective. At first, Vokril dismissed it as desperate resistance, the last throes of a dying species. Then the bodies started appearing. The executioners, elite warriors bred for slaughter, had been found. Their bodies mutilated, their armor stripped, their weapons missing. Worse, some had simply disappeared. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. Vokril's claws tapped against the hollow table. "Explain," he growled to his war strategist. Nervous flick of mandibles. "They are adapting, High Chancellor." Vokril's eyes narrowed. "Elaborate!" The strategist hesitated before pulling up a grainy recording. It was from one of the patrol units, body cams attached to the executioner's armor. The footage began with a standard sweep of a ruined district. Silent, empty. Then movement, flicker in the shadows, a glimpse of something darting between collapsed buildings. The executioners raised their weapons. No communication, no sound, just the mechanical precision of a hunting force. Then one of them dropped. No scream, no sound, just gone. Panic rippled through the unit. They shifted into defensive positions, scanning the darkness. Another fell. Then another. The last moments of the recording were nothing but static and the rapid, desperate breathing of the final executioner. A whisper echoed through the feed, spoken in a language foreign to Xelvari ears, but unmistakable in its meaning. "You're the ones being hunted now." Silence. Vokril's mandibles clenched. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not a war. It was a demonstration, a lesson. But it was the Xelvari who were learning. Elias wiped sweat and dirt from his brow, his breath steady as he crouched beside the shattered remains of a Xelvari patrol unit. The aliens were big, powerful, and heavily armored. Their strength was in their numbers, their superior technology, but they weren't invincible, not against humans who refused to break. His squad had been running hit-and-run strikes for days, turning the ruins of Hadria-IV into a death trap. They used the terrain, the rubble, the very destruction the Xelvari had wrought against them. "I don't get it," muttered Corporal Reyes, crouched beside him. "Why are they still here? They should have just wiped us out from orbit." Elias exhaled. "They want a message. They want us to surrender, to beg." Reyes spat. "Not happening." A sound from the distance, heavy footfalls. Elias held up a fist. "Incoming." The squad melted into the shadows as a new Xelvari patrol entered the sector. But this time, they weren't just executioners. This time, the Xelvari had brought war machines, bipedal constructs armed with energy lances and scanning arrays designed to detect movement. Elias felt the shift immediately. The Xelvari weren't just hunting them anymore. They were afraid. The first explosion sent a shockwave through the ruins. The Xelvari war machines staggered, their advanced sensors blinded by the carefully laid traps. The humans had studied their technology, learned how to disrupt it. The second explosion tore through the squad, forcing the surviving Xelvari into a tight formation. They fell back toward what they thought was a safe position, a collapsed structure with high walls that would provide cover. They didn't realize. It was a kill box. Elias and his team waited. Let them settle. Let them think they had found a moment to regroup. Then the humans struck. Gunfire erupted from the shadows, precise, calculated. Grenades were tossed, forcing the Xelvari to scatter. One of the war machines toppled, its systems fried from an electromagnetic pulse charge they had salvaged from Xelvari wreckage. The fight was brutal, but it was fast. The Xelvari, for all their might, had never faced an enemy that fought like this, relentless, unpredictable, willing to suffer if it meant victory, and then it was over. The Xelvari lay dead. The war machine was nothing but a smoking husk. Elias stepped over the bodies, his gaze hard as he studied the last remaining executioner. The alien was wounded, its mandibles twitching as it glared at him with something Elias recognized. Fear. He crouched, leveling his rifle. "You wanted to make an example of us," he said, voice steady. "Now you're the ones being studied." The executioner hissed, barely able to speak. "This was not how it was meant to be." Elias stood, shouldering his weapon. "No," he said, "it never is." And with that, humanity had turned the lesson back on its teachers. The Dominion had underestimated them. The Xelvari had come to Hadria-IV expecting a swift execution, a display of power so absolute that humanity would crumble under its weight. Instead, they had ignited something they could not contain, and now the war had truly begun. The Xelvari war camp was in disarray. Where once their forces had operated with machine-like efficiency, now there was hesitation, uncertainty. Reports of human ambushes had thrown their command structure into chaos. Entire squads had gone missing, but the real shock had come when a single human had walked straight into their camp. Sergeant Elias Caney stood before the Dominion's War Council, his body battered, his uniform torn, but his eyes steady. The executioners surrounded him, their weapons raised, yet none dared to strike. He had come unarmed, a single human standing in defiance before the architects of his species' supposed extinction. "You misunderstand something fundamental," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You thought you were fighting to teach us a lesson." He took a step forward. "But humans don't break the way you expect. We don't fight the way you predict." Vokril's mandibles twitched. "You walk into our stronghold as if you are the conqueror," he hissed. "You are alone. You are finished." Elias tilted his head. "Am I?" Before the Xelvari could react, the ground beneath them shook. Explosions erupted across the camp, detonations placed by his squad in the hours before his arrival. Their ships, their war machines, their defensive turrets, all turned to flames in an instant. The executioners moved to strike, but then something else happened. Their own weapons turned against them. The lights flickered, holographic interfaces glitched. The Dominion's encrypted battle network suddenly collapsed, their commands overridden, their drones shutting down. Elias allowed himself a small smirk. "You think we're just soldiers, just creatures who claw at the dirt when we're desperate. But you forgot that humans build things too. You weren't the only ones watching, studying." Rhea's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Systems are ours. They can't call for reinforcements." The Xelvari War Council erupted into chaos. They had controlled the battlefield. Now they were at the mercy of the very species they had sought to destroy. Vokril could not comprehend it. This was a species that should have crumbled. They were outmatched, outgunned, and yet they adapted. They learned, and worst of all, they fought without fear. Elias stood before him now, hands loose at his sides. He had every opportunity to finish this, to slaughter the War Council where they sat. The Xelvari had never hesitated to eliminate their enemies. But Elias? He simply studied Vokril with something foreign, something unsettling. Pity. "You could leave now," Elias said. "Take what's left of your fleet and run, or you can stay and learn what it feels like to be hunted." The weight of the words pressed down on the council chamber. The Dominion had never lost a demonstration before, but they were about to. Vokril felt something cold creep into his chest, something alien to his kind. A lesson. The humans had not been the ones to learn it. They were the ones teaching it, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Dominion fleet abandoned Hadria-IV before the next sunrise. What remained of their forces, shattered war machines, broken executioners, and silenced command centers, was left as evidence of their failure. They had come to make an example of humanity. Instead, they had been the ones laid bare before the stars. Sergeant Elias Caney stood atop the ruined watchtower, the distant glow of the departing Xelvari fleet reflecting off the clouds of smoke still rising from the battlefield. The humans had won, not with superior firepower, not with sheer numbers, but with something the Dominion had never accounted for: defiance, resilience, the will to turn oppression into resistance. Corporal Reyes climbed up beside him, exhaling, as she watched the alien warships vanish beyond the atmosphere. "Never thought I'd see the day," she muttered. "They ran." Elias nodded. "They ran." Reyes smirked. "So what now? Think they'll come back?" Elias didn't answer. Immediately, he knew the truth. The Xelvari were not the kind to forget a loss, especially not one as humiliating as this. Their pride had been wounded, their perception of superiority shattered. But the problem with fighting humans wasn't just that they were stubborn, it was that once you forced them to fight, they got better. "They'll come back," Elias finally said. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but next time it won't be to make an example of us." Reyes raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" Elias turned, looking toward the horizon, where the battered but unbroken human resistance forces were gathering. "Next time, they'll be afraid." The great tribunal convened in secrecy, far from the eyes of the public. Vokril stood before them, silent as the footage played once more. The final irrefutable proof of their miscalculation, the lone human battered but standing, the impossible sabotage that had crippled their war camp, the moment their forces had turned and fled, the moment the Dominion had lost. A counselor spoke, voice filled with unease. "They should not have been capable of this. The humans do not have the technology, the experience." Vokril's mandibles twitched. They didn't need it. Silence hung in the chamber. For the first time in Xelvari history, a species had resisted them, had forced them to retreat, had rewritten the lesson the Dominion had sought to teach. Another counselor spoke, voice hushed. "What do we do now?" Vokril stared at the image frozen before them, the humans standing amidst the wreckage, fearless, unbroken. He closed his eyes. "We adapt." Because if they didn't, he knew what would happen next. The humans would be back, and next time they would be the ones teaching the lesson to the entire galaxy. The message had already spread. From the outer colonies to the great empires of the galactic core, the story of Hadria-IV burned like wildfire through the void. The unstoppable Xelvari Dominion, who had erased civilizations without a second thought, had been driven back by humans. No species had ever defied them and survived. No species had turned the executioner's blade back on its wielder. Until now. Sergeant Elias Caney sat in the cockpit of a stolen Xelvari scout vessel, watching as Hadria-IV grew smaller beneath them. The humans had held their ground, but this was only the beginning. The Dominion would never let this stand, and humanity wouldn't be waiting for them to strike first. Reyes leaned against the co-pilot's chair, arms crossed. "So where to now?" Elias studied the star charts. The Xelvari had left a trail of destruction across countless worlds. Many had fallen without a fight, their people enslaved or worse. But if there was one thing the humans had proven, it was that submission wasn't the only option. There are others out there, Elias said. Species who think they don't have a choice, who think they can't fight back. Reyes grinned. And we're going to prove them wrong. Elias nodded. The Dominion had made a mistake. They had come to break humanity's spirit. Instead, they had forged something far more dangerous, a rebellion. Vokril stood before the towering screens of the Xelvari High Command, his claws tightening as intercepted transmissions filled the chamber. The humans were moving, not just surviving, not just resisting. They were organizing reports of skirmishes on outer Dominion-controlled worlds, supply depots raided, entire squads of executioners vanishing without a trace. It was happening faster than the Council had predicted. The lesson humanity had taught them had not ended with Hadria-IV, it had only just begun. A holographic transmission flickered to life, the shadowed figure of the Dominion's Supreme Chancellor looming over Vokril. You assured. As a victory, the Chancellor said, voice like grinding stone. Vokril lowered his gaze. I miscalculated. The Chancellor's glowing eyes narrowed. No, you misjudged them. The image of Elias Kane appeared, pulled from the final moments of the battle. A single human standing in the ruins of a world the Dominion had failed to conquer. The humans are not like the others, the Chancellor mused. They are something else entirely. Vokril clenched his fists. Shall we strike again? Annihilate them before they spread further? The Chancellor studied the image for a long moment before speaking. No. Vokril stiffened. No. The Chancellor turned, their voice filled with something unfamiliar. Not anger, not frustration. Curiosity. We will observe, the Chancellor said. Let them grow. Let them believe they are winning. A slow, deliberate pause, and then we will see what humanity truly is. The transmission cut out. Vokril turned back to the holographic screen, watching as humanity's rebellion spread like wildfire across the stars. One thing was certain. The war was far from over. The galaxy was watching. Every empire, every species, those who had feared the Dominion, those who had bowed to their rule, all now whispered the same name, humans. A species that should have been crushed. A species that had no right to stand against the Xelvari and live. And yet they had done more than survive. They had taught the Dominion fear. Deep in the lawless fringes of the galaxy, a hollow message played across the underground networks. The image was grainy, broadcast through hijacked Dominion frequencies, but the message was clear. Elias Kane stood against a backdrop of stars, his uniform still bearing the scars of Hadria-IV. His voice was calm, steady, and carried across the void like a war drum. This is a message to those who think they have no power, he began. To those who have lived under the Dominion's rule. To those who have watched their worlds fall. He stepped forward, his eyes burning with quiet defiance. They wanted to make an example of us, to teach us submission. A pause. They failed. Across the galaxy the message was received. By enslaved species working under the Dominion's yoke. By freedom fighters hiding in the ruins of conquered worlds. By those who had believed resistance was impossible. Until now. Elias's voice turned harder, sharper. We are still standing. We are still fighting. And now the lesson is theirs to learn. The feed cut out, but the echoes of his words remained, and they would not be forgotten. Far beyond the reach of human space in the dark heart of the Dominion's homeworld, the Supreme. Chancellor stood alone in the great observatory. From here, she could see the swirling expanse of the galactic core, the ancient stars that had burned before the Xelvari had ever risen to power. She had seen countless species rise and fall, empires crumble. But humanity was something different, A low hum vibrated through the chamber, signaling an incoming transmission. The Chancellor did not turn. She already knew what the report would say. The humans were spreading, not just as survivors, as revolutionaries. A slow exhale. For the first time in millennia, the Xelvari Dominion had encountered something they had never planned for. An enemy they could not break, an enemy they could not predict, a force that did not just fight for survival, but for something greater. The Chancellor's voice was barely above a whisper. So this is humanity. The stars outside the observatory burned bright, and war was coming.